Hey, what's going on, guys? 118 Set Shadow here. So, for today, I'm gonna go over a deck profile for Shadowverse Evolve. And today's deck profile is going to be around Forestcraft, the craft that is all about fairies and elves and foresty type stuff. And of course, it's a combo-oriented deck. And today I'll be going over a deck that I'm constructed. I took it to a local recently and managed to win out of 3 rounds. My matchups were against Swordcraft and Rune, and I'll be going over those a little bit more after the initial deck profile. So let's go ahead and take a look. So as I was saying before, Forestcraft is a deck that revolves a lot around forest type creatures. You'll be seeing lots and lots of fairies when you play this deck, which are token units that are used for lots of combo-oriented abilities that allow you to do a lot of damage in terms of little bits that just accumulate over time. And then you also have the ability to reuse a lot of your cards by sending cards on your board back to your hand in order to use them a second time, while also getting some additional bonuses. And as the game progresses, you will get the ability to do various sorts of things, such as control-based skills that can kill your opponent's board, or eventually just wrap up the game with a lot of power. Or you just try to make it to the end game where this card, Rose Queen, is your main win condition, trying to deal bits of damage at the late game that will be enough to just finish your opponent off in one go. So now let's take a look at the actual deck build itself. The deck is 40 cards main deck and 10 cards in the Evo deck, and being Forestcraft, uses Orisa as the leader. Taking a look at the deck build itself, let's see what we've got. When we talk about Shadowverse or Shadowverse Evolve, normally we also talk about a curve, given that this game is built on a mana system where you'll be able to play low-cost cards initially and progressively be able to play high-cost cards. The way Forestcraft tends to work is it plays a lot of low-cost cards that enable you to play multiple cards in one turn. And so you can see already that there are 5 different one-cost cards in this deck, and in terms of how many there actually are, 6 one-cost cards. No, there are 5, and of them, there are 4 of them that are maxed out at 3 copies apiece, and then you have 1 that is at 2 copies at this point. So we have Bellring Ranger to start off with. It's a neutral card, but a generic ward, and pretty much a staple for the deck to keep yourself well defended throughout the game. May is a good control card, and also an early play for ping damage. Fairy Circle, good for generating additional fairy tokens that you will need for the late game, or just using for early ping damage or combos. You have Nature's Guidance, which will allow you to send cards back to your hand, and then it draws you more. You also have Harvest Festival, which gives you healing and also draw power. This one is the only amulet in the deck, and is quite critical when it comes to certain matchups. If we look at 2 cost cards, we have a grand total of 5 different ones in this deck. And we're starting with the Ancient Elf, which is also a critical component to the deck. Just like with Nature's Guidance, this card allows you to send cards on your field back to your hand, and then it gets powered up based off of that. Following up, you have Archer, which is used for board control. Every single time a unit is put onto your board, then you can choose one of your opponent's units and deal it 1 damage. Then you have Fairy Whisper coming up next. Fairy Whisper allows you to summon a fairy to your field and then play another one to your EX area. So it's basically a 2 cost that splits itself into 2 1/1s. And then of course you have Rhinoceros, which I'm playing at 3 in the deck. This card is a combination of board control and also great ping damage, as well as a potential finisher. and we'll talk about that as we get to the Evo deck. For some more board control options and also off-turn options, you have Sylvan Justice, which allows you to deal 3 damage to one of your opponent's units and then put a fairy into your EX area. Then we get to 3-cost cards, and we have 3 different ones here, starting with Elven Princess Mage, which its only effect is for evolving. We will get to that later. We have Noble Fairy, which is also board control, great for taking out really big bodies, and it also has Ward to protect you. Rose Gardener, like Elven Princess Mage, is in there for Evo purposes, so we will talk about that a little later. The only 4-cost card in this deck, Execution, is a neutral spell that allows you to destroy any card on your opponent's field, whether it be an amulet or a follower. It's critical for certain key piece destructions, and it did come massively in handy when I played it in tournament. Then we also have Aria Fairy, who is the only 6-cost in the deck. This card is one of the key components to your main win con, where it summons as many fairies as possible to both your board and your EX area. And then, of course, the win condition of the deck is Rose Queen. This card takes any pixies that you've got in your EX area and changes them into Thorn Bursts, which can deal enough damage to your opponent to finish them off, as long as Rose Queen also gets an attack in. Then we look at the Evo deck. We have 1 copy of the Evo of the Bellringer Angel, which is good for early board control, and it still has Ward, which is critical. You have 1 copy of the Ancient Elf Evo, which does the same thing as the original, and still has Ward. It's just a bigger body than the original. You have the Evo of Archer, which shares the same stats as its non-Evo version, but instead of pinging just 1 unit, it pings 2 units for damage at a time. Then you have the Evo of Rhinoceros, which is one of the 2 3-ofs in the Evo deck right now. This card has great utility. It can either get Storm, or it can deal damage to your one of your opponent's followers based off this card's attack. You have Elven Princess Mage, which on Evolve allows you to get 2 Fairy Wisps to your back row. And then you have Rose Gardener, which allows you to choose one of your opponent's units, send it back to their hand, and then draw 1 card if you are in combo 3. So, just some generic talk on how this deck works is it plays on a ramping up curve where you start off with a lot of low-level cards that you can play early. You don't have as many high-level cards to play, because since Forestcraft usually relies on combo-based abilities in order to get bigger effects down the line, you want to be playing a lot of cards in one turn. For that reason, you also want many token generators and a lot of draw power to maintain your hand so you can keep on using combos. The combo base cards in this deck, you have Noble Fairy and you have Rose Gardener as the official combo cards, but you also have Rhinoceros, which gets powered up based off of the number of cards that you played during the turn. Those 3 cards all rely on you playing lots of cards for the turn or a certain number in order to hit the abilities that they want. And then main concept for when you get to mid-game is just to continue to see if you can deal more ping damage and keep the board under control so that you can safely play your Aria and then just be able to clear out a bit more of the board utilizing the fairies that Aria generates. But the main thing is for Aria to fill up your EX area so that when you get to 8 points, you'll have access to Rose Queen, which will change all of them into Rose Bursts. Rose Bursts, or Thorn Bursts, are 2-point spell cards that do 3 damage to either a follower or the opponent's leader and allow you to draw a card. So the deck is comprised of lots of small followers, lots of bouncing abilities to let you reuse them, thus raking up your combos and allowing you to perform really big actions at the end of each combo. And then of course you just have some spot control and stuff like Execution in order to deal with stuff that you normally can't. That's the other purpose of Noble Fairy in this deck, as because this deck does not do a lot of damage at once, dealing with bigger followers is very difficult, and Noble Fairy has the ability to eradicate them immediately without having to do a lot of ping damage. So now that I've gone through the deck itself, let's go ahead and start taking a look at some gameplay. So let's take a look at some gameplay for Forestcraft, starting with how you might want to open the game. So we have a starting hand here of 3 1 costs, and then you have the 8 cost Rose Queen, which is your only 8 cost in the deck. This is not a bad hand to open with at all, especially since now you can play the game early, and it's actually not too bad for a going first or a going second hand, because you actually have some options depending on which one you take. Let's say you go first. If you go first, normally you'll just start off with the Harvest Festival, and you'll pass at that point. And then if we go to the next turn, here we will probably just... It also depends on the matchup. You could play the Bell Ringer for an early ward if you're dealing with rush decks. If you're dealing with decks that try to drag the game, like Rune for instance, you might consider just trying to continue to draw into pieces, so you'll play the Nature's Guidance to bounce your Harvest and draw another card. Then Harvest will let you draw again. Not really seeing any pieces there, but at least you can play the Harvest a second time, move on to the next turn. We got another Nature's Guidance, so we can try the same thing. Well, we're at least picking up some more cards, although we just got to the limit. And so we'd probably just end up playing something like the Harvest and Bell. Bell can also draw you cards as well. If you're going second, it also depends on the matchup again, but say you were playing against Swordcraft or Havencraft. Sword and Haven may opt to play cards like Maid Leader or Prism Priestess on their first turn, aiming for an Evo on their next turn in order to search their deck. That's where this card comes in. Elfchild May is a 1 cost, where when it plays, you can choose one opponent's unit and deal it 1 damage. And both of those cards are 1/1s, so by dealing it the damage, you immediately get rid of it and stop their search. And of course, you can always play the Nature's Guidance on the May for the subsequent turn. That lets you draw, and if your opponent played another card, you can ping it for another damage. If it's not finished off, you can ping it for another damage by replaying the May. Ultimately, it's not bad. That sort of hand to start with like this is not bad at all, because it does give you some turn play whether you go first or second. There are varying ways you could play out your first hand, but this is actually a pretty good one. This deck runs 4 different types of wards in the deck, of varying cost and different types of abilities. You have Bellringer Angel, which is one of the few neutrals in the deck, but this one is pretty common to see in a lot of different crafts right now, and Forestcraft really wants to get a hold of this card. It draws you a card if it's destroyed off its last words. It can evolve into a new variant that can deal 2 damage on evolve for board control. It's all around a really good card, and because it's a 1 cost, it works well with the combo heavy plays of Forestcraft. Then you have cards like Ancient Elf, which is probably the most generic ward that you're going to find in a Forestcraft deck. This one has the ability to bounce any card that you've got, send it back to your hand basically, and then gain a 1/1. It has an evolve that does the exact same thing, the power and the bounce, eventually making this a 5/5 with ward, which can also just swing in for 5 damage. It's very strong, and in future decks it is considered a staple as well. Then you have Noble Fairy as your next card up in cost, which is a cost 3. You can just play it as a 3/3 ward, but the big thing about this card, and for me it's a tech card, I don't see too many Forestcraft decks run this one, but I find it to be really good, especially since Dragon is considered to be the strongest deck right now in the meta. Noble Fairy's special ability is a combo 3, which allows you to destroy any follower on your opponent's board and exchange it with a fairy token. Because Shadowverse Evolved does not have the concept of transform, I believe this is basically what this is supposed to be. So you destroy a follower, then just give your opponent the follower that it was supposed to become. I don't think Shadowverse Evolve is going to apply transform in the way Shadowverse did, but I digress. This card is good for getting rid of really big units that your ping damage will not be able to get rid of. Your final ward in the deck is Aria, Fairy Princess, which is also one of the best cards to enable your win condition. Aria has the special ability to fill your entire board with fairies. In other words, if you have a completely empty board and you throw an Aria down on it, it will allow you to play 4 fairies to the front and 5 fairies to the back. This gives you a total of 9 fairies to work with, and all the fairies that you summon will have Rush. Even if you summon them back from the EX, those will also get Rush. Aria herself is a 5/5 ward, but a 6 cost, so more often than not, it probably won't survive the turn that it is played, but it's still quite capable, and if it does survive, it's a 5 swing to the opponent's face, which is still pretty strong. So now let's talk about one of the other key components of my deck, one which might draw some controversy from other Forestcraft players given how I chose to play this. So this is Rhinoceros, which, if you come from the original Shadowverse, you know that this is a dangerous card to play against, as it's part of an OTK from the original formats of the game. But in comparison to the original Shadowverse, this Rhinoceros starts off with Rush as opposed to Storm, but it retains the original fanfare effect where it will get an additional attack point for every other card that you played during the turn. So if you played 3 cards and then you played this, it'll gain 3 attack points and be 4 attack with 1 defense. But if you evolve Rhinoceros, it has the ability to either gain Storm, or it can choose one of your opponent's followers and deal damage equal to its attack. And because it's evolved, it inherently also has Rush, meaning that it has the ability to attack, allowing you to do spot removal on 2 cards given that one of them is resting and you have enough attack points to deal with it. Most decks that I've seen so far play they play 2 or 3 copies of the regular Roach and then 1 to 2 copies of the Evo, but in my deck I chose to just go 3/3. The reason being is that Roach has great spot removal, and it's also very good for dealing a good amount of damage mid-game, or even at a late-game stage. The way I look at it is that because the current meta includes decks that have the ability to heal themselves and therefore get out of the Rose Queen OTK, I find Roach to be pretty important to offset any of that healing so that you get closer to the Rose OTK, or at the very least, you'll have the ability to finish your opponent with Thorn Bursts rather than having to attack with Rose Queen if you're continuing to ping damage with stuff like Fairies and then get in a strong blow with Rhinoceros mid-game. Ultimately, you may need to do it once or twice, meaning that it's a good idea to have at least 2 Evo Roaches, but I run the 3rd because I've just found it useful for both spot removal and then just swinging in at critical points to deal enough damage where your Thorn Burst can finish the game, or at least get the opponent to concede at some point. Let's talk about some of the other deck options that I have selected for this deck. So let's start off with Elven Princess Mage. This card requires an Evo to utilize its full effect, which is on evolve, it allows you to get 2 Fairy Wisps and put them into your EX area. Fairy Wisps are similar to fairies, but they're 0 cost, so you can play them completely free. This is really good for being able to enable combos earlier if you don't have enough play points. Normally your decks are combo 3, and your combo 3 cards are currently 1 Evolve Follower for Rose Gardener and the Noble Fairy. So if you need to use one of those really early, but you don't have enough play points, you can use this card to summon these Fairy Wisps to your EX area, use them mid-game to enable your combo 3s earlier. This is also good for Roach if you're trying to go in with a Storm Strike, because this can add on 2 more cards to increase Roach's attack point by another 2, and then deal some more damage to your opponent. Then, of course, we were just talking about the Rose Gardener, so why don't we go with that next? Just like with Elven Princess Mage, its ability is based off of its Evo version. This card allows you to choose one of your opponent's units and bounce it, and then if you're combo 3, you can draw a card. So this is basically alternate spot removal. It allows you to get rid of some followers that may be troublesome to you, and if your opponent played an Evo, you can force the Evo back and just force them to evolve it again, and if they somehow used up all the Evos for a certain card, more than likely you screwed up their strategy, and now because they can't Evo anymore, they usually have a useless card in hand. But of course there are some detriments in that for some cards that you're trying to just get rid of, your opponent does get the opportunity to play it again. So if it had a fanfare effect, you're allowing them to play it again. And against something like Dragoncraft, that's problematic when you're dealing with something like Fafnir. Fafnir will always deal 5 damage whenever it hits the board, but sometimes you just don't have the cards to destroy it and you're forced to bounce it to avoid damage. Other cards that exist in this deck are... Let's go with Fairy Whisperer next. This card allows you to summon a fairy and also put a fairy into the EX area. So it gives you 2 bodies on the board that can be used for ping damage, and then it starts to build up your EX area for the Rose Queen turn. The same thing for Fairy Circle. This gives you 3 fairies to your EX area, building up for the Rose Queen turn. But of course, if you have Aria, you're likely just going to be using those fairies early on for ping damage, or to enable combos, or just to apply some early game board pressure. Then you also have Sylvan Justice, which is a quick card, so you can use it on your opponent's turn as well. But this card does 3 damage to 1 follower and then gives you another fairy to your EX area. So it's good for early spot removal, and if you were able to deal enough damage to a follower, you may just need the Sylvan Justice to completely finish it off, as you do a lot of ping damage, and then this 3 might just be the right amount needed to finish it. And for certain plays, Execution is really good to have, at least as a 1-of in the deck. I found it incredibly useful in my first matchup against Swordcraft, where I was really down and then my opponent played the Royal Banner about mid-game, and I couldn't afford that banner to sit on the board, and Execution has the ability to destroy followers and amulets. So destroying the banner enabled me to win the game, as my opponent was not able to deal enough damage to finish me off, and because their followers were not buffed up, they were far easier to kill. But this card is really good. There's a reason that this is a $5 card right now and is played in almost every deck in the format. So let's go ahead and talk about some pros and cons of this deck. Forestcraft is a craft that is combo oriented, meaning that you get to play a lot of cards in a turn, and on top of that, your combos are not very linear. You can actually play varying sorts of strategies depending on the hand that you are dealt. You have some typical combos for good draw power, and then you have win-con combos to ensure that you actually get to your Rose Queen and Thorn Bursts. But the thing is, you have various different ways of achieving your win con, and you have various different ways of still even winning the game. Roach himself can also be considered an alternate win con, assuming that you manage to ping enough damage and then you could finish the game with Roach if you manage to get him strong enough and your opponent has no wards. Archer is really good for spot removal. Roach himself is good for spot removal. Effectively, this deck has a lot of good control aspects as well, hence why this deck is called Rose Control. There's lots of ping damage here. There are good options for dealing mid-range damage to get rid of mid-sized followers. And so this deck is quite capable. And the draw power in this deck is not too bad. With Nature's Guidance and Harvest Festival, you have a draw 2 combo right there with the 2 of these, and then each of these itself gives you the ability to draw a card in the event that you don't have one or the other. And because of the bounce capability of Nature's Guidance, you can pull off a bunch of different skills with cards like Elfchild and May, or you can choose to save certain cards that you don't want to have destroyed on the next turn by simply bouncing it back to your hand and then replaying it on the next turn. So Forest has a lot of versatility and lots of different plays that you can make. It's not that linear to play, so that actually ends up being one of the downsides of the deck, where it's actually pretty complicated. Because your plays are not linear, and because you kind of have to work with what you have, you may not end up playing ideal scenarios or optimal hands very often. Rose Queen, for instance, I talked about how this is an OTK once you get to turn 10. But your opponent's not just going to sit there and let you have a Rose Queen on the board for 2 turns, or even 1 turn if you chose to play it on the 9th, and then hit you for 22 damage right off the bat. Not to mention, there are decks that can heal to the point of getting over 22 health, which means this will no longer be a valid OTK. That's why you have cards like Roach in the deck to offset those decks from their healing, and also just to ensure that even if you can't maintain the OTK by getting Rose Queen to swing in, if you can get your opponent down to 12 life, usually 4 Thorn Bursts are pretty sufficient in order to finish them off. But other problems with this deck include its consistency. So this deck has draw power, but it doesn't have any searchability. You can't search any of your pieces. There's no search in this deck. You have to draw them. Every single card in this deck has to be drawn. That's why you have options to be able to draw your cards, and not just from the main deck. You also have the Evo of Rose Gardener, where if you combo 3, it will also draw you a card. And of course, Bellringer Angel also draws you cards. So you do have enough options to draw, but you may be disappointed because you're not drawing the cards that you need. So if you find yourself just never drawing the cards you need, this deck may not be for you. On top of that, when you think of competitive play, this deck also has another disadvantage in comparison to most other decks, which is the time factor. Because Forestcraft is a combo-based deck, and because it mostly does ping damage, even with its own win con, you may not be able to deal enough damage to your opponent in turns. If you're behind on damage, and I had this scenario when I was playing in tournament a few days ago, I was playing against Swordcraft and I was unable to deal any damage to the guy for over 10 turns. So he was still at a full 20 life while I was actually below 10 and just frantically trying to make sure I stay alive. However, I was able to beat him through sheer war of attrition. So I was able to fully control his board throughout the game, despite taking all that damage, to the point where he ended up by about turn 13 with no board, staring down a field of 5 units with 2 wards and only 1 Tsubaki in his hand. So even if he had drawn into something else, he was dealing with 2 wards and wouldn't have been able to deal me any more damage. And because I had the Rose Queen set up with some Thorn Bursts on the board, I wouldn't have been able to Rose Queen OTK him, but I could control the rest of his board, get rid of the Tsubaki that he had, and eventually deal him enough damage for the finish, so he just conceded once he ran out of cards. So I can effectively say I won without dealing a single point of damage, but the thing is, in a competitive tournament, if that situation happened in time, it's very unlikely my opponent would have conceded and instead played it out for the turns, because he was still at full health and I was below 10 health. So I would still need to get him below 10 health within 3 turns to be able to win the game. Because Forest does combo plays multiple cards in a turn, and your plays are not linear, you need more time to think through your plays, you need more time to play your plays, and that will make it so that you run out the clock and you won't have time to deal enough damage if the game runs on long. So far from what I've seen, most of my games all fall under 20 minutes. And if you watch the recording of my first game against Swordcraft, you'll notice that that game took under 25 minutes, which is currently the time frame necessary for being able to... That's the time frame for an official game right now. Ultimately, this deck is complicated to play because it's a combo-oriented deck and it's not linear. The time factor makes it less plausible for meta, and because this deck uses a lot of small cards, it's harder to deal with very big cards. If you're dealing with Dragoncraft, you're going to be dealing with big board wipes like Fafnir, big units like Forte, and then you have big defense units like the Dragon Guardian. And you have Shenlong to deal with as well, which is also pretty big on defense. So getting rid of those takes a lot of cards. That's why I play the Noble Fairy to easily spot removal big units, but you don't have a bunch of Noble Fairies in your deck. The rest of your control is usually ping cards, which means you may have to take heavy damage at some point in order to actually go in for the finish on certain games. With Forest, there's almost no situation in which you can win a game without taking damage. That's something else that you have to understand, is that if you're playing Forestcraft, you need some grit. You need to have some grit to be willing to take damage, even heavy damage, just to ensure that you can get enough damage to finish your opponent off. This deck is pretty rewarding once you understand how to play it, and if you know a lot of your combos in and out, you have a lot of versatility and can play with almost any hand. But I will say that there is one more heavy disadvantage because of this deck's inability to search, and that's with the mulligan. The way the mulligan works in Shadowverse is that you draw 4 cards, and if you don't like the hand, you have to put them to the bottom of the deck and draw 4 more without shuffling. Because you don't shuffle, and because you don't search the deck, you have no opportunity to shuffle this deck. Meaning that the 4 cards that you put to the bottom of the deck will be gone forever. Because it's very, very rare for you to actually get to the bottom of your deck with this craft. Your opponent may force you to shuffle it with Altered Fate, but then you're depending on your opponent to shuffle your deck for you, and that's not going to happen very often. So always be aware that whatever hand that you put down for a mulligan, you'll probably never see it again. If you somehow end up in the really unfortunate situation of opening with 3 Rose Queens, you're going to have to find an alternate way to win, because you are not seeing those Rose Queens anytime. But that's basically Forestcraft in a nutshell. And it's a complicated deck, but one thing I can definitely say is it requires grit. You need to play the game of attrition. Most importantly, never give up with this deck. It may look like you're down on so many instances, but you have opportunities to bounce back. Even if it looks like you're down, if you're dealing with Rune, your board might get wiped every turn. If you're dealing with Dragon, you're taking heavy damage while struggling to get rid of their board. When you're dealing with Sword or Abyss, you're trying to stay alive in the face of their rushes. With Forest, you cannot give up in any of those situations. Know your deck, trust it, and play it out to the very end. You may be very well rewarded like I was. And for me, Forestcraft is my favorite craft. This will be my deck until this game is over. Thank you for watching until the end, and I hope this was useful to you. If you have any comments or thoughts, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe if you haven't subscribed to the channel. And I will see you guys later.